The thing that we have become increasingly aware of is that many times here, the same thing happens that happens in the church on Sunday. The people go on Sunday, they hear the sermon, and right out on Monday, they right back there into the capitalist European bag, doing the same thing, right? What we are proposing is that as Africans learning our history, learning how to think in an African way and how to become spiritually Africans, that we then begin to act in that way, first of all, to each other, then to our families, and then to begin to create specifically the African world so that you know it's not a dream. So that we want you to keep this in mind while you are incorporating some of the information that you are going to receive today, put it in alongside of what you have learned in the past, reject the European philosophy, proceed to your African being, and at least we can look down the road and say, very shortly, we're going to be home. Sam, Dr. Ben is strolling around outside. Would you ask him to stroll in and get that slide projector, please? Good. We will ask Dr. Van Sertima today, who has done an outstanding job, especially in the last 2 issues of Journal of African Science Civilization. He thought he was going to start talking before me. Dr. Clarke is also coming. Now, these 2 are most significant. I suggest very strongly for yourselves that you secure a copy. Further, that for your children, friends, and relatives, you secure copies because you can give them as gifts or you should be using them to educate in your homes, because there is so much to be learned from both of them. And this material, in conjunction with Dr. Ben's written materials, and also, as soon as we can, Sheikh Anta Diop's Civilization and Barbarism, you're going to find that you have a full-scale African education. So today, after the lecture, make sure you purchase your copy, and if you don't get one today, we'll have them available next week, right? Now I should like to introduce we need your tape recorder. His slide recorder. Slide protector. And we have the 3 giants now greeting each other, and we're in good shape. Dr. Van Sertima? We'll find out in a minute. All right. Just a moment. And leader, General number 1, Sister Kefa, will do the opening ritual.
But you are interfering. You have to. Are we ready, brothers? Okay. In praise of African gods, in the tradition of our ancestors, and in celebration of our history, the First World Alliance invites you to share in our opening ritual. To honor our elders, with those Africans over 60 years of age, please stand. To honor our children, those who are with us and those who've left us. With the youngest African child in the house, please stand or be held up. To honor African life, with those sisters who are carrying a child in their womb, please stand. Let me see some sisters. Oh, wow. Somebody's not doing their homework.
Are the sisters home working or what?
Oh, they're delivering, okay. Well, let's honor African American life, okay? Brothers and sisters of the First World family, we do thank you. And Brother Jones, are you ready? I'm sure he is. Okay, we bring to you now Dr. Ivan van Sertima.
It is very difficult to attempt to deal concisely with what blacks have given to the world of science and technology, because the very roots of science and technology lie in Africa. But it is important before I begin to speak on this subject, and by the way, everything I shall speak of today is contained in this book, Blacks in Science, Ancient and Modern, with illustrations, etc. Before I begin to speak on that, I must point to something that is of very great importance, and that is civilization is not merely the development of complex technologies, although such complex technologies did in fact develop in Africa as elsewhere. Civilization involves a humanization of the human. The movement from the animal is not only a movement that involves the creation of various tools to deal with one's environment, it also involves a change in the state of man, a change in a certain state of consciousness that lifts us from the level of the brute. Thus it is quite possible for people to become technological in an advanced sense and yet to remain uncivilized. What Hitler done, and Hitler was a natural evolution of what was going on in Europe at the time. What Hitler done indicated that an enormous immaturity, a barbarism had developed in Europe in spite of the growth of technology. And that barbarism has not yet stopped, because we have reached to that sad state which is inevitable, where one does not civilize the spirit along with the civilization that comes with machines. We have reached a situation where our machines have begun to mock us, and where most of the money that is spent on machines, billions of dollars spent on machines today, are spent on the creation of things that will not bring us greater life, but ultimate death. A great deal of the machines that are built today are death dealing. And it is quite possible, therefore, that technology has reached a stage through the peculiar conditions out of which it arose in Europe, the exploitation of man by man, of race by race. It has reached a point where the vision behind that technology, the spirit behind that technology, ultimately brings death, because it has arisen out of the death and blood of other peoples. It has been built upon a strange evil. It has been built upon the horror of others, until, therefore, written into the machines themselves, most of the machines, is a certain death message. Thus it is that in spite of the extraordinary complexity and advancement of modern science, we are now on the brink of a tremendous catastrophe. Let us hope that this catastrophe does not happen. But let us also hope that it becomes possible to leaven that catastrophe, to make it impossible, to the infusion of a different kind of spirit, a different kind of consciousness in the world, a consciousness that can only largely come from those people who've not been involved or not been involved in the administration of that technology, who've not been involved in the death that is read into that technology. I would never forget my interview with Dr. Lloyd Quarterman in Chicago. Dr. Quarterman is one of the 6 blacks who worked on the atomic bomb. And he spoke of the doubts that he had, the fears that he had in the way Oppenheimer had fears. And he spoke of times when he would be working in his laboratory at 2 o'clock in the morning and would find other people snooping on him. 2 o'clock in the morning. They had to find out exactly what he was doing. And that even at that stage when he was on the verge of death, yet he was unwilling to confess to me some of the things that were very important. For example, he would not allow me to put on tape the fact that it was through his work that uranium-235 is made into 238 or something like that, and that on the basis of that breakthrough, they had built the first nuclear facility in this country at Oak Ridge. None of those blacks are mentioned in any study of modern advancement. Yet, the Secretary of War gave Quarterman his award. And Quarterman remained loyal, even though rebellious. When he started to work on synthetic blood, for example, which the Japanese have now begun to perfect, and he does not know whether it had anything to do with race, but because perhaps someone else had started out with that idea, someone else had the same idea, he was pulled off the project. He created one of the most extraordinary series of compounds. He actually started to play around with the atoms and molecules and to create new compounds in advances that were not paralleled anywhere else in the world, to create new compounds out of this play with molecules in the way, for example, biochemists today are playing around with genes. They were forced to an oath of utter secrecy. Even his condition, he was secret about, because it was clear to me as we sat there with our tape recorders that this man was dying. He would not admit that he'd been poisoned by radiation in those laboratories. He was so poisoned that when we had the tape recorded, there was so much radiation coming out of this man as he spoke that there was a whistle coming out of the recorder, and our needle was going very quickly. We had to spend many weeks in order to hear later what he had said, because the power inside of this man and the strange secret things that he had imbibed in his work had even affected our capacity to record it. You are not aware of the many things that are happening today right in our laboratories which blacks are responsible for. I have been in Bell Laboratories, for example. It's just outside of New York in New Jersey. There you have quite a number of African Americans who have made significant contributions to the sciences. At Bell Labs alone, which is the largest private research facility in the world, not just in this country, you have men like Brian Jackson, and I'm only picking a handful now. Brian Jackson, who invented a computer that can see far more than the human eye looking through a microscope. A computer tool so fine that it can inscribe thousands of circuits on a wafer so thin that you cannot see it without a microscope. Whereas they were putting hundreds of circuits on the wafer, Brian Jackson has invented a machine that can see and inscribe circuits, thousands of circuits, on a single wafer as small as a postage stamp. As in a space as small as a postage stamp, he can put down 64,000 bits of information. Cortland Robinson, also in New Jersey, a scientist there, has developed a system whereby he can test the stress on a microelectronic device. He can test the stress that it will go through in a year in a matter of hours. He can bring upon the pressure upon that circuit equivalent to a year of stress, so that he can find out what kind of coating materials can cover those microelectronic devices which are so critical in the computer age. We have Robert Ingram, another African American who's developed a global memory system. At the time when machines become obsolescent very quickly, you bake a machine and in the next 2 years they've made an advance and that machine has to be dismissed. It is already gone out of fashion, or it cannot serve the same purpose. He's invented a global memory whereby this machine, which initially could take in just about 64,000 bits of information, grew up to take in 16 million, and now he has built it to take in 500 million bits of information. All these things have profoundly affected the revolution in microelectronics in this country and in the world. You never hear of these men. They're all in New Jersey, all probably rubbing shoulders with each other. You have Northover, who developed a fantastic light fiber guide, whereas we use wires now to conduct messages. We have these electric wires. He invented a light fiber guide where messages move at the speed of light. Well, radio waves also move at the speed of light, but there are slight obstructions. Here, a fantastic system has been developed which moves faster than anything that has been developed before. And it not only moves with great speed, it is built out of something so thin, it is thinner than the human hair. You can take a 4-foot rod of this thing that he's developed and stretch it to 16 miles. The fiber is stretched from 4 feet to 16 miles. And then another brother, Thomas Cannon, has developed a way of finding out flaws in this system, and he has also gone under the ground in Chicago and other places, and all the tools and all the parts that are used in this development comes under his inspection. He in fact has the name Cannon stamped on these things because he has helped to carry further the work done by Northover. And Al Richardson, also of the same laboratory, has written the guidebook for the world for laying cables under the oceans that link the continents, using the same fiber guide. So all these scientists are carrying forward each other's work. You find he's invented a laser alarm so that if the fiber, anywhere the fiber twists and is about to break while it's being manufactured, an alarm would go off and you'd be able to correct that light fiber. And then there is James West, who in fact I was introduced to and who should have written this article in the first place but was too busy. But James West is the man, the co-inventor of what is known as foil electrics. When you see things like these lapel microphones, hearing aids, and all of these things, there's a principle involved that springs out of the work of James West. He has invented a microphone that is as thin as a sheet of paper and that is so sensitive it could pick up your heart pulse. And you'll see him, if we get a chance to show our slides today, you will see him in what is known as the world's quietest room, the anechoic chamber. All of these things done in that field alone, and that is just one field. When we go to the space sciences, and I've been at NASA, and I spent some time at NASA, I've been in their laboratories, I've been in particularly among their photographs, etc. And you find what blacks are involved in at NASA is also quite startling. Few of us are aware that the most advanced space machine in this country and in the world, the reusable space shuttle, that all the work, all the preliminary work that led to that shuttle from babyhood to blast off, all of that was coordinated by an African American, Major Gillum. Have you ever heard of him? All these things are obscure, but then you see on television and you see in the newspapers as these very simple but strong, healthy young men who are blasted up in machines that they have almost nothing to do with. They learn how to use it. But these are scientists standing behind these fantastic developments whom you never hear of. Major Gillum is the director of the Dryden Flight Research Center, coordinating many of the space developments. And one of the leading technical astronauts in the American space team is Major Gregory. Gregory was one of the 3 men who were sent into the space shuttle before it's taking off on a journey to check everything. Gregory is the man who was chosen to remake the brain of the space shuttle, the cockpit, which is the brain, not the heart, but the very brain of the space shuttle is that cockpit. And somebody or a number of people screwed up the first cockpit because it had problems. It was Gregory who was chosen to redesign the cockpit for the next 4 shuttles. That Gregory is such a great inventor, he has practically transformed safety in aircraft. He has invented a microelectronic ground system, safety device, whereby a computer locks the plane from the ground and you can land that plane on the head of a pin, whether you're dead or drunk. Therefore, wipes out the possibility of pilot error in grounding operation. This is an extraordinary achievement, and there is a picture of him sitting in the middle of the airplane, blind. There are two pilots in front just in case there's a problem. But they're taking quite a lot of risk. They're sitting in front, looking through the window at the sky, and Gregory is sitting in the middle of the airplane, looking at the blank wall and landing the plane perfectly, without the slightest mistake. This is something that he helped to develop, and this is now accepted, and it would transform the safety in landing operations in our aircraft within the next 15 years. Major Gregory also invented an alternate power controller which enables the pilot to deal with all the systems of the aircraft, turning, starting everything with one hand, leaving the other hand free, cutting pilot fatigue in half. This is just a few of the works he has done. You're aware also of Bob Shirney in the space program. Bob Shirney is the man who invented the tires on the moon buggy. Those tires had to solve three problems. They tried many designs that would not work. Shirney turned up with the design, a tire that was 10 times lighter than any Earth tire, yet would carry the weight of all the instruments and the man on the moon, and would be able to move on the ground of the moon and have the traction to hold on to a body, a celestial body, that has 1/5 the gravity of Earth. It was Shirney also who devised the space commodes, the refuse disposal units on the first spaceships. Those of you who may think that is a simple problem, when you have a call of nature in space, it doesn't go down, it goes up. So he had to find a way that these things could be sucked away very quickly and effectively, because you can't just jump up from your seat and walk to the toilet, you'll just float. And they tested his model on the Apollo spacecraft, and it worked perfectly, but we were always experimenting, so they tested another model and it burst. And it was a very uncomfortable landing, because everything was floating around in that cabin. There are also sisters working in the space program. There's one from Brooklyn, Dr. Pat Cowens, who's developed some of the most advanced work done in space medicine. She has done something akin what is called by some quantification of yoga. It's a yogic exercise. You know, in Western exercise, we expend a great deal of energy. But in the Eastern, you could just make like that, and you could make your heart stop or slow down, etc. Remarkable things you could do with your muscular and nervous system by learning a method of breathing, etc. Now, when you're in those space machines that we have today, which are pretty small and that are not as large as Star Trek or Starship Enterprise, you can't go jogging in the morning. You have to sit in your seat. And you have to exercise. If you don't exercise, you face enormous problems when you come out of space. You have to learn to walk again. Because when we are on this planet is spinning, as you know. We are not stationary. We appear to be stationary. The reason why we stand here is because there are pressures, so many pounds per square inch, that are locking us to the planet. If those pressures were taken off, if some stars were to disappear in the sky one day, we would all float up. We would not have those pressures. Everything is related very carefully. Life on this planet is almost a miracle in a sense, because it takes so many things to make it possible. And if you go out into outer space, you find you float. You can't stand on the ground. If you go to jump on the moon, you go through this roof. Because if you jump 5 feet on Earth and you jump with the same force, you go 25 feet on the moon. And if you go into outer space and you're sitting in the space cabin, if you don't know how to exercise without running around, etc., fluid collect in your limbs. So all sorts of fluids collect. And so when the first spacemen came back, they had to train them to walk. And one of them never recovered his balance. In fact, I think there is a story which was hushed up that he committed suicide, because he never recovered his balance. He would keep falling over. And she has devised a system whereby the spacemen can exercise their nervous and muscular systems without moving from their space seat. And Then there is Dr. Christine Darden, who's done some of the most advanced work on solving the sonic boom. For those of you who don't know what sonic boom is, one of the most advanced aircraft, not military aircraft, but civil aircraft in which normal passengers fly, is the Concorde. They tried to ban the Concorde from New York. It created lots of problems because when a machine like that jumps beyond supersonic speed, when it goes faster than sound, as many machines do today, it can create a bubble of which, when it bursts, can shatter thousands of windows and even shatter eardrums. She has found a way to crinkle that bubble by altering the nose and fuselage of the aeroplane, and thereby to crinkle the bubble. Now that is a significant achievement because it means that we can move more easily from supersonic to hypersonic aircraft. As a consequence, in the 1990s, we'll be able to go to California in 1 hour, so that we will leave at 2 o'clock and arrive at noon, going back into time. The work done in space and in communication science are those that I have concentrated on, but those that are little known and should be celebrated are those that have been done over the past century. Few of us are aware of the obstructions that have been placed against African American scientists in their struggle to patent their inventions. In 1878, which is just about 100 years ago, the Attorney General of the United States passed a law making it impossible for a slave, and sometimes in cases of ex-slave, to patent an invention, because he said a patent or a patent was a contract between the government and the citizen. And since black slaves are not citizens, they cannot patent their invention. As a result, several devices that were developed in slavery could not be patented, and as a consequence, lots of these things were not claimed to be done by blacks. But in spite of that, by 1913, 1,000 patents were registered by African Americans. Right. Even in spite of all the fact that some of them had to do it through their lawyers or through their slave owners, etc., yet 1,000 were patented by free African Americans. Elijah McCoy is the first man to invent a machine that could lubricate itself. He invented steam engines that had automatic lubrication, so critical, so absolutely critical to the modern machine age. Jan Matsalega from the West Indies produced the first machine that could mass produce shoes. To produce a shoe took quite a long time, and it was a laborious process. Matsalega built a fantastically complex machine to enable people to produce many shoes in a few minutes. And it was the first machine for mass producing shoes. One of the most critical contributions to the Industrial Revolution is by Norbert Rillieux, also from the West Indies, who invented a machine that could take sugar juice and turn it into sugar crystals, cane juice and turn it into sugar crystals. Those sugar crystals were critical to the wealth of England and France. That is where they were able to take the Caribbean and turn it into gold. They called it a kind of gold because they came here out of the greed and lust for gold. They found very little, but they turned the plantations into kind of gold, and the sweat of the black was used to produce that gold. Louis Latimer, and John Clarke has a fine essay in here dealing with some of Latimer's relationships with other inventors of the period. It is true that Edison pioneered the electric light, but Edison could only keep that light running for a few hours. It was an African-American, Louis Latimer, who developed a carbon filament that enabled the light to burn for thousands of hours. It was he who lit New York. It was he who lit London, literally lit it. He went there and supervised the lighting of the streets of New York and London and Philadelphia. And Garrett Morgan, the first man to invent an automatic stoplight, which now is used throughout the world to regulate traffic. He was the first man to invent a smoke inhalator mask. Louis Temple, who invented a movable harpoon and thereby transformed the harpoon industry. And you have also a black who invented a machine which transformed the food transport industry in this country. They were using primitive blocks of ice in order to keep the food as they moved the trucks across the country. It was an African American who invented a machine, who invented a method of refrigerating the trucks so that they could save the lots of spoiling that occurred of food when those blocks melted. So even down in the modern period, and this is just scratching the surface. This is just scratching the surface. When you go into medicine, the many things that African Americans have done in that field, in blood plasma, in all of these things, you become aware that a vast underground of genius exists. And these things are seldom written about, they're seldom promoted, they're seldom circulated, they're seldom advertised. And when we go back to the ancient period, we find the roots of technology itself lie in Africa. All we have been told, all that we have learned over the centuries, particularly the last 5 centuries, we have learned of how we were dragged out of the bushes and we were taken by a technologically superior society and a technologically superior people, and we were given the accoutrements of civilization, and we should be grateful to that. And we are also given a religion, the Christian religion, we should be grateful to that. And now we find not only have they stolen our Christ and made him blonde and blue-eyed, but they have also stolen our claim to technology. Because when you go in Africa, within the last 5 years alone, those 5 centuries of myths have been exploded. They said the Chinese invented fire. They invented the domestication of fire. That is moving from just fires that jump out like that. The sun hits and the fire jumps out. To domesticate fire is actually find a way of making fire. And some of you see the quest for fire. There are no blacks in that. They said the Chinese invented fire 400,000 years ago. And the Europeans probably caught up with that about 200,000. Now they found that Africans were doing that 1,400,000 years ago. In the field of agriculture, they have found settlements, agricultural settlements. All these are contained, all this is contained in this book. Fred Wendorf Steen discovered at Wadi Kubani in Egypt and at Wadi Tushka in Nubia that the Africans had developed agricultural settlements and were growing cereals and barley and einkorn wheat 17,500 to 18,000 years ago, 7,000 years before any other people or civilization. They entered the age of agriculture where man stops merely hunting and gathering. They continued to hunt and gather because this was a supplement to their economy. But they entered the superior phase from hunting and gathering to settled cultivation of crops, conscious cultivation of crops, 7,000 years before any other people or civilization. And Professor Nelson Steen discovered just 2 years ago in the Lukania Hill district of Kenya, about 25 miles from Nairobi, the capital of Kenya, that Africans were domesticating cattle 15,000 years ago. And that is very important because those things are the critical groundworks of civilization. I do remember very vividly the first week I went to London University that I was invited to a party by Count von Heimendorf. And at that party came one of the illustrious racists of our time, C.G. Seligman, a man who wrote The Races of Africa, in which he stated that the skills, the sciences of cattle rearing were brought in by the Asiatics, the Asiatics, and that it diffused to the dark, dull-witted agricultural Negroes. It was in that, just the year before I entered that university, or was it the year after? Somewhere around 1966, because I entered in 65. It took me about 10 years before I could get into university. In 1966, the Regius Professor of Oxford, a man who's just, Trevor Roper, who's just been in the news because he said at first that he was sure those were Hitler's diaries, and then after all the experts got on the case, he said he's not so sure. These are the experts. He was sent by Churchill to find out about certain things about Hitler at the end of the last war. It was he who got up and said, when the students were clamoring then for courses on African history, said, African history? There's no such thing. There's only the history of Europeans in Africa. The rest is darkness. Darkness is not the subject of history. 1966. This is the leading scholar in the field. When my book came out in 1977, March 13th, 1977, they picked a man like that, Glenn Daniel, who hadn't done any anthropology for 10 years, who had never set foot in Africa, who'd done Neolithic studies in Europe, who knew absolutely nothing about the prehistory of America. He was chosen by the New York Times to attack my book. He said that my book was a sad, bad, mad book. The time has come when we can easily dismiss him as a sad, bad, mad man. There was a time when it would be possible to be destroyed by criticism like that. My book could have come to its death right then, because the New York Times is very powerful. And in fact, because of that critique, my book cannot be published in paperback by any major firm. And even those people who have attempted, black firms who have attempted to take it over, to do it in paperback, they have been charged such a high prices to make it prohibitive, so they have to retreat. That book will for a long time, unless something unusual happens, remain in hardcover where it is difficult for our students to get it. And for some time, when the Science Digest brought out an article on me, Black Kings in Ancient America, and there was a raid on the book, there were thousands of inquiries, and Random House sent out a notice in Publishers Weekly. They came before Columbus is out of print. And I raised the matter with them with great force. And then they issued a retraction saying the book is not out of print, the price is now increased to $16.50. As someone said once, when I remarked on this, it's not out of print, it is out of reach. And they are going to contain it in every British publishing firm has turned down that book. They would not touch it. And every paperback firm in this country has refused to touch it, including Howard University, which said that they do not question my scholarship, but they're not big enough to handle a book like that. This book is as big as that. It has 304 pages. I handled it. I'm big enough. Why isn't Howard big enough? They do not know the accuracy with which they're describing themselves. When we look at Africa, let us begin with the Egyptians, because those are our ancestors. And there is no question now, as there has been for centuries, not in our minds any doubt any longer, that those Egyptians are our true ancestors. As Dr. Ben and John Clarke and others over the past century have labored hard and long to establish this. Their voices at first were faint voices, and voices in the wilderness too, because it was absurd even to suggest this. Now, it is very difficult to retreat before the evidence. Bruce Williams and Keith Seal made a discovery in the Nile Valley of the kingdom of Ta-Seti. Ta-Seti in Nubia in the Sudan, where the blackness of people is never in doubt. They have even taken Nubians at one stage and says, look, the Nubians are servants of the Egyptians, the black servants of the Egyptians. And they show them prominently in their chariots as black servants. But as soon as they go to the skeletal evidence and they find that there isn't much difference between the Egyptian and the Nubian, they're all of the black variety, they say that skeletal evidence must be placed in doubt. They have reserves about it. As soon as they have evidence that they're not dealing with servants but kings, it becomes a different matter. It took 15 years, and I find it hard to believe it took 15 years to put the pieces of Ta-Seti together. Nevertheless, the revelation has come out that in that kingdom of Ta-Seti, 10 black kings reigned before the Egyptian dynasties. 10 black kings reigned south of the Egyptian world before that, those Egyptian dynasties. And in that area of Ta-Seti, they found all the major royal and priestly symbols. They found the falcon god Horus. They found the unmistakable shape of the Egyptian crown, the major Egyptian crown on the head of the black kings. They found the hieroglyphs, the world's first major writing system, which was not only to affect other writing systems like the Meroitic later on in Nubia, but was also to leave its mark on European writing systems, on the Phoenician writing system, which was to be carried through that Mediterranean and some Asiatic writing systems. That was found first among the blacks at Ta-Seti, even before it moves up into Egypt. One of the problems with respect to Egypt must be pointed out, because there are questions and questions and questions. Why is it that some of the faces of the Egyptians have Caucasoid features, some have Asiatic features, etc.? This is because in the early dynasties, the dynasties that were absolutely critical to the development, the foundation, the establishment of Egyptian technology, like the pyramids, the establishment of its political structure, the establishment of its religions and philosophy, the figure reigning in Egypt is predominantly and unmistakably black. However, there are one or two dynasties that are not African. You have interloper dynasties, invader dynasties. You have the Hyksos or Hyksos who, coming around 1660 BC, invade the black land, Kemet, the black land, invade it and seize power for 150 years until the blacks rise up against them. It's a time of weakness. 150 years is not a long time in a kingdom that reigned for 3,000 years. There is no civilization on earth, no great empire that reigned for 3,000 years. No European empire ever went as long as a millennium. 1 millennium, 1,000 years. That is an insignificant period, and it was not a period in which any major technological or religious innovation occurred that wipes out classical Egyptian architecture or technology or philosophy. And there are periods in the late decline after the fall of Egypt. They like when they see black faces in the 25th dynasty, they say period of decline. But the European came in the period of decline. That is where you see the majority of Caucasoid faces. The Romans and the Greeks in the Ptolemaic period, you can see a Caucasoid pharaoh, yes, in the Ptolemaic period. Those are the invader pharaohs. Right. Those are not the true Egyptians. Right. So don't get confused by those things, and occasionally there is the odd mixture. There is intermarriage. A king can do what the hell he likes. So that these are things to be borne in mind when one re-examines the audience, when one re-examines the evidence. And these things have been selected out and placed to us to confuse us. There are many representations of kings and queens. They pick those that look only slightly African and slightly European to bring King Tut here. When you find that the blackest ones, which make it quite clear that King Tut is an African, those they leave back. When they were questioned, they said they're too fragile and delicate to travel. The Egyptian achievement is remarkable. The very first division of time in the world is African. It is the African who created the second of time. It was he who defined it precisely. The first clocks in the world were created by Africans, the water clock, the shadow clocks. These clocks were created by Africans. Let me touch on some of their first major inventions which are so critical. The invention of a calendar which still affects us today. A calendar invented 4241 BC. Some people put it at 4236 BC, as if anyone would quarrel about those 5 years. Calendar, it was taken by the Greeks when they invaded the Africans, the Egyptians, and then it appears later among the Romans and then among us. And that calendar was altered. There were two major modifications. The Africans had 12 months of 30 days each. They were regular months. They were cut regularly into 12, and at the end of the year they had 5 days for the festival of the gods, and they had a complicated way of dealing with the leap year. The Greeks scattered those 5 days among the months. As a result, we now have 28-day months, 29-day months, 30-day months, 31-day months. We need a rhyme in order to remember which is which. And we have, of course, developed another system of dealing with the leap year. But that has its roots. Even to begin the day at midnight is African. At least the Egyptians do that. Not all Africans do that. By the way, the Swahili do not do that. And I remember, and I have pointed to this before, that I was in Tanzania, and I was waiting for a train which was leaving at 6:15. And I'd come rather early, and I turned to a girl beside me, and I said in Swahili, when is this train coming? And she said, Kesho. And I had learned in London that Kesho meant tomorrow, but nobody had told me tomorrow begins at 6 o'clock. Which it naturally should in some places, because that is darkness. That is the movement from day into night. But we begin the day at midnight. The Egyptians did that, and that custom was taken. The cubit, the inch, the second of time, the second of arc, all those are African. Those are to become basic measurements. Weights and volumes and time measurements were African, taken from the Egyptians by the Greeks, and later they were to talk about the Egyptian as not being precise. You look at mathematics, the Greek used cumbersome letters. This 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 didn't start in Europe. It started among the Hindus. And who do you think got it accepted in Europe? Fibonacci went and he got these things in 1202. But when he brought it into Europe, the Europeans would hear none of it. They were using letters for numbers, letters in the alphabet for numbers, a clumsy system. But then they were only doing basic maths. In the European universities at the time, in the 13th century, they only learned arithmetic, bits of Euclidean geometry, which has been translated from Egypt into Arabic, and the Arabs that had entered Egypt, and that is what they were doing. The church was afraid of numbers. They wouldn't accept it. It's only when the blacks and other Arab people, light skin and black mixtures, and because the Arab is not a race, so lots of people came in, but the Moorish thing was predominantly black. It's a mixed bag, and you can find occasional white Moor. But when they went into that Europe, they took aspects of mathematics that were absolutely critical to the European Renaissance. And then, of course, the European always forgets where he got his stuff. That 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, we call it Arabic numerals. It's not Arabic, but the Arabs got it accepted into Europe in the commercial activities, etc. People have said, we don't have mathematics. But that was the state of mathematics in Europe. Do you know in the Spanish Inquisition, which is as late as the 1600s, it was an offense, a capital offense. You could be executed for studying advanced mathematics. It was a capital offense. That was the primitive state of mind in Europe at the time. In Africa, they found a Shango bone 8,000 years old. In Congo, Zaire, 8,000 years old, the first evidence of the use of numbers in the world. And they have found complex mathematical systems among the Yoruba and other major peoples in Africa. Why didn't they find it before? Because they were looking at primitive tribes. This is a great obsession with people who go to Africa, even today. Let me find the wildest little tribe, the smallest little tribe with the funny little ritual and the funny little dance, and let's study him. All right, I am not dismissing those people. I'm a primitive. I grew up in a jungle in South America. I grew up among Native Americans who were primitive. But those were on the edge. That doesn't mean the primitive is uncivilized, because civilization is not necessarily a question of machines. But it is important to understand that technologies that are complex and advanced occur at the primary centers and cores of civilizations. And that if you're only looking on the edge, like in the jungle where I was born, if you're only looking on the edge, you may think that is the totality of the achievement of my people. You have to look at the centers. The centers evaporated because they were attacked and shattered. So that we have been looking only at the edges of that African world. All the anthropology, all the history that we have learned over the centuries has concentrated obsessively upon the edges of the African world, so that we come away with the impression that is the totality of the African. And today, of course, the African is a sad spectacle. It is necessary for us, and I say it to Africans too. It is necessary for us, African Americans, for all of us in the black world, African Caribbeans, African Americans, Africans, throughout the world, to join together to remake the world we have known. It is not an impossible task. When Christ was born, there were 3 kings that appeared in the heavens. We know, of course, that that is an Egyptian myth. Not Christ now, but the myth that was built around Christ. I will not, regardless of what has been said, I will not dismiss Christ. He is a brother. What has been done in his name by those who later claimed him after crucifying him and tormenting and persecuting those who followed him, I will not listen to what they have to say about him. But I know that there is a historical reality behind that man. Right. And that through his peculiar individual example, he was able to do extraordinary things. He spent his boyhood in Africa. He wasn't born there, but he was smuggled there. He spent his boyhood at Marathia, a village in Africa, until he was 12. We do not know what happened between his 12th and 30th year. Some people said he studied Egyptian Essenism. And when you look at his philosophy, you see that he is given an individual and particular quality to something that operated among those people. The European found it difficult to become Christian even after he claimed him, because it was not native to that world. It is true, however, as has been pointed out here, often by Dr. Ben and Dr. Clarke and others, that there were myths about the 3 kings, myths about the Annunciation, myths about the virgin birth, myths about the resurrection, and that these had roots in Egypt and other parts of the black world. That is true. And around the core of a historical reality and an individual life, many myths were put on to make it more acceptable. So it is possible, therefore, to believe in Christ as a symbol and as a model for human life. and at the same time to be aware that there is the African mythology that builds around this core, that is a cover, as it were, that builds around this core of historical reality. When we look, as I say, at the Greek debt, the Egyptian science, we are aware of how many of the Greek men of science, the great scholars, the great priests came to the Africans after Alexander attacked Egypt. John has often spoken of the Greek society as young, struggling, trying to get itself together, and going to the older and wiser African civilization. They poured into Africa. Thales of Miletus, Democritus, Pythagoras, Eudoxus, all of them went into Africa to study at the foot of African teachers. Then they were to come back taking their Pythagorean theorem and their theory of harmony and opposites, lifting pages, actual pages, page for page, out of African medical texts. And then they come and tell us we wrote nothing. And they're the father of this and the father of that. When we look at Egypt at the time Greece attacked Egypt, we find that they were superior in glass making, metal fabrication, mining, irrigation systems, shipbuilding, etc. They'd already worked with the lever and the inclined plane. Yeah, they were to claim Archimedes was the father or the inventor of the lever and the inclined plane. All the so-called fathers begin with the Greeks. Why? Because the Greeks are the fountainhead of European civilization. So that whatever happened before is irrelevant or imprecise or unscientific. Or they put us among the magicians and the witch doctors. And recently I'm beginning to wonder if the witch doctor shouldn't be looked at again more seriously. When you look at the pyramids, to which we have the most rightful claim, the only claim, because those are the years when those pyramids were set down, when there was no question whatsoever as to the Africanness of the Egyptian. There was no question. Even the word Africa, and there's lots of dispute about it, and I'm sure that there are other names for Africa. But I do know that the Egyptians had Afroika, meaning birthplace. So while there are other names, because there are many names for places, Egypt doesn't just have the name Egypt. Egypt is not even African. The name, Misri, Egypt, etc. Kemet, that's the name we gave it. So that there are lots of names floating around the place, and many of them are equally valid. But I am annoyed when people come and tell me, but Africa is a name given to Africa by Europeans. Europe did not name Africa. Africa was named by Africans. Europe comes from Europa, an African princess. Europe is named by an African. When we come to touch on their medicine, we are aware of the fact that not only the theory of harmony and opposites, but that Hippocrates stole from medical texts several operations like fracture the clavicle and dislocation of the mandible and all of these things, page for page, taken word for word and pushed out as though it was his own work. What extraordinary theft, and the shamelessness behind it, and the arrogance, the racial arrogance that was to spring from that. Because our problem today springs basically from a certain kind of arrogance that developed in the world. Hitler is the best example of it. The great master race. When he tried to track down his own history, he had to retreat from it because he found that he was not a true Aryan. Even he, the man shouting about Aryan master race, suddenly discovered that if he were to apply his rule, he would have to be wiped out. Shockley, I understand, the man who claims about the superior brain, and he's one of the people who is into the gene pool. Somebody told me, and I'm saying somebody told me because I don't know it for certain. And if I knew it for certain, I'm not repeating it. But I understand from a source that may be reliable or unreliable that Shockley's children do not live up to what he has claimed, that the genes of geniuses produce geniuses. When we look at the pyramid, the Great Pyramid in Egypt is 1/2 the height of the Empire State Building. It's built 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, yet it's half the height of the Empire State Building. And in its area, it takes up 12 blocks of Manhattan, 12 blocks of Manhattan. And half the height of the Empire State Building taking up 12 blocks of Manhattan. All those skyscrapers you see out there are puny beside it. It's large enough to hold Westminster Abbey, St. Paul's Cathedral, the cathedrals of Florence, Milan, St. Peter's Basilica, and Rome, and there'll still be room for more. It's 13.1 acres, and not only does it have an extraordinary size, it's built with fantastic technology. Recently, the Science Digest has run an article on how they got light into the subterranean chambers of the pyramid. They found that the Egyptians had trapped the sun's light and thrown it onto a metal mirror, and thrown it onto another metal mirror, and onto another metal mirror, running right through the corridors, carrying the light of the sun right down under the earth by using a relay of mirrors. And they built ventilator shafts that not only opened on the sun, but opened on certain stars. The extraordinary skill and power of those men. The right angles at each corner of the base of the Great Pyramid line up the walls perfectly. You cannot understand how hard it is, even today, for engineers to build, the engineers to build such a pyramid, to build something 12 blocks of Manhattan, so the ratio of run to rise is perfect. It is only out by 0.6%. The north base is 755.44, the south base 755.88, the east base 755.77, the west base 755.77. They said that the north-south axis was off by a few degrees east or west of north until Grahamson and Pauli discovered, two geophysicists discovered, that the world had shifted slightly off its axis since the Africans built the pyramid. It was the world that had moved. The African engineers were there. I will come in a moment. I will speak for perhaps another 10 minutes, and then I will come to deal with the slides, which would give you an opportunity to see some of the things I've been talking about. Not all of them, unfortunately, are on slides, but they are all in this book, Blacks in Science, Ancient and Modern. They have said that slaves built the pyramids. They have now found lists which indicated that the majority of people who worked in the pyramids were African peasants in their off time. And the infantry, the African infantry, who were not then involved in great wars. And that only 5% involved slave labor. And when we study the word slave, we find it is very, very, very different from what the Anglo-Americans call a slave. In all wars, one captures prisoners, and there are also criminals who are forced to do slave labor. In this country, for example, many of the brothers are slaves still, locked up behind walls. And I'm not talking now about the subtler kind of slavery that exists outside of the walls. I'm talking about real slaves, criminals locked up, many of them driven to crime through extraordinary circumstances. Great distress. I get letters from the prisons asking for journals of African civilization. The brothers save up to 3 months to buy one copy. We wish we could have afforded, we could only do it for Attica and Trenton State, but we wish we could have afforded to let all those prisons have one copy free. There are brothers who write from prisons far across the country to get a copy. They came before Columbus. This guy sent me a check. I called the prison, they wouldn't let me speak to him. I asked a message to be relayed to him that they sent back the copy. After the brothers spent all the effort to purchase a copy, they sent back the copy saying he has no permission to receive it. So I asked the message to be relayed to him that I'm not robbing him but that he has to get special permission to receive the copy. They would not give him the message. The brother not only doesn't have the copy, but is sitting there thinking that some brother outside is cheating him. The fantastic distress in which so many of us still live. The distress in which so many of us live because of the profound contempt for black people, a profound contempt which has become part of even of our own systems, whereby we turn on our own brothers, we internalize that contempt. Let me, before we come to deal with the slides, touch on some of the inventions in other parts of Africa outside of Egypt, because it has often been claimed that the Egyptian thing was one great flare and flash, and after that died down, there was nothing else. Many empires grew up in Africa, in North Africa, in Southern Africa, in West Africa, not just in Nubia and in Egypt. They have found, for example, the steel machines in Tanzania. The steel machine, 1500 to 2000 years old, around the birth of Christ, or a little later than the birth of Christ. A machine producing steel in the middle of the Iron Age when nobody could mass produce steel. The Africans along Lake Victoria were producing steel in quantity. And they found that where they were producing this steel, they were living in a density of population that indicated urban centers rather than the little villages in which they live today. That steel production was in a machine where they were blasting, they were producing in their blast furnace, they were producing a heat of 1,850 degrees centigrade, the highest temperature ever achieved in metallurgy in Europe or anywhere in the world until the 19th century was 1600. The Africans were doing it in 1850, producing a fine bloom of carbon steel and using what is known as the semiconductor technology, which is unknown until the 20th century. They were producing it through the growing of iron crystals when Europe was doing it through the sintering of solid particles, which is a cruder process and takes 2 stages. And they found that the Haya people in Tanzania remembered the details of this machine so that they could reconstruct it, so that when Schmidt and Avery, who made the discovery, found 13 of these machines under the earth in Iron Age strata, they were identical with the machines which these men remembered. In other words, Africa had not completely lost it. It had lost the capacity to act because of invasion and colonization, but it had not lost the capacity to remember and therefore to act again if it could only recover its consciousness. Just a few months after, they found an astronomical observatory on the edge of Lake Turkana. It's known as Namoratuunga, the place of stones. And there they found Africans there in Kenya, in northwest Kenya, had built an astronomical observatory 300 years before Christ. And that on the basis of the stones aligned with that observatory, they had built one of the world's most accurate of prehistoric calendars. They found among the Dogon, and many of you have heard of that, the Dogon are one of the most civilized people in the world. If the kind of science that sprang out of the Dogon, the peculiar blend and marriage of the empirical and the intuitive, the spiritual and the material aspects, if that kind of science had entered the world, today we'd not be on the brink of self-destruction. They plotted an invisible star, Sirius B. They plotted its orbit and trajectory up to the end of the 20th century, up to the year 1990. Just a few weeks ago on television, you see them dancing the orbit of that star. They had a celebration 5 to 7 centuries ago known as the Bardo celebration. They call that star the egg of the world. It is absolutely impossible to see that star, even with the African eye, because the African eye, it's now discovered, the African eye is capable of a magnitude of 8.1, the European eye is capable of a magnitude of 6.5. Even with that greater shutter speed under those unusual conditions of dark adapted eyes, yet it could not be seen. The question arose, therefore, how could the Africans plot the orbit and trajectory of an invisible star? How could they tell it had an elliptical orbit of 50 years around its parent star, Sirius A, and an orbit on its own axis of 1 year? How could they do it? And Kenneth Brecht, MIT, wrote in Technology Review saying, the Africans have no business knowing any of this. Fortunately, I have met the editor of Technology Review. He came to one of my lectures to educate himself at MIT. And he's now given me permission to write a 6,000-word article in African science so that he can retrain his readers. I have talked of the complex mathematical systems, and I must mention, as I have mentioned here on more than one occasion, because it is very significant, that when Zaslavsky was studying African mathematical systems below the Sahara, she met a Yoruba mathematician who said, how come you're talking about Yoruba mathematics and I am Yoruba and I'm a mathematician and I know nothing about it? It is like us, we are African Americans, and our men are producing incredible things in their laboratories here and in the space industry. We know nothing about it. When you go and you tell these people well, what the blacks are doing, what are you talking about blacks? Science is neither black nor white. Science is science. But then when you hear the shout is, why are you trying to study science? You're black. Blacks are not into that. You know, blacks are not involved in tech. Even the blacks started to believe that. Songor started with his nonsense about reason is Greek and emotion is Negro. We are the men of the sensory plane, the great emotions. We are not supposed to be the great abstract thinkers. Well, we were the first thinkers of the world. Laid the basis of the philosophical system, the basis of technology, the very ground upon which Europe and Asia was to build. They had their genius too. Every human being has a genius. I'm not going to dismiss that. I am not here to prove that Europeans were incapable. They were capable. But they fed upon that genius. They borrowed much and denied it. They made themselves the center of the universe. They were supposed to have all the monopoly of genius. No one else was supposed to be involved. We are the peripheral people. We are the so-called illiterates. We are the oral people. Oral people, my ass. American civilization which uses the English language, that language has no script. The script we are using is not English. The English never developed a script. They are oral peoples. This is the Roman script. They had to be colonized by other Europeans before they had a script. And this is true throughout the world. There were Africans who had scripts, the Akan, the Manding, the Meroitic people, the Egyptians, the Nubians. They had scripts, and there were others being found even in the jungles of South America. They now found the Nafaka script, which the Africans brought over with them when they came. Right. But scripts were restricted to secret societies and police castes and trader circles and things like that. And this was true throughout the world until the invention of the printing press late in the 15th century. And there were whole tribes in Europe that had no script, like the English, for example, and quite a few. Not just the English, we point to them because people seem to think that they're so very literate. Their medieval kings were illiterate. Right. And many great men in the world were illiterate. Christ was illiterate. What book did he leave us? He left words, oral. Muhammad too was probably illiterate. I don't know any book by Muhammad. He left words, oral. So even if one speaks of so-called orality. It has nothing to do with wisdom and intelligence. Mutesa II, the king of Baganda, when he was overthrown, he came to England and they found that he had one of the most phenomenal memories in the world. This is an African king who sat down for several months and dictated non-stop 700 years of history. Which one of these literates can contain in their head the details of 700 years of history? And literacy too, this is one of the myths of our so-called illiteracy, lies in the fact that many of our documents were burnt. The libraries of Alexandria, which had about 1 million documents, sacked, ruined by the Prussians, burnt by barbarians. The libraries of the Moors, to which many blacks contributed when Arabic was the language of science. The very language Arabic, the very script, sorry, not language, the script, the Arabic script was invented by Abu Aswan, an African. Read the biographies of Ibn Khalikan, page 606. And those Moorish libraries were burned to the ground in the squares of Granada. Cardinal Ximenes ordered the burning of those libraries. They would have none of us, none of our knowledge and wisdom. Things they would take and steal and later claim to be their own, but they would burn our things. In America, in the same decade, thousands of manuscripts were burned. The Native Americans wrote thousands of books. Only 3 of them survived. Only 3. Bishop Lander said, burn them all, they're works of the devil. The arrogance of these people. And this is what is called civilization. That is why it has reached this sorry stage, where the very technology begins to mock the man who created it. Not created it, sorry, borrowed and misused it. Because this is why people become afraid of science. Because science now takes on an evil look. You turn on TV. What are they doing with the machines? Everything death, 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 death. The psyche is loaded with such enormous guilt and such blood, the blood of centuries, that the only thing in the computer, the only message carried forward, shoot them all, burn them all, break it up, so that it becomes almost as if the machine, the very thing created to liberate us, would turn its guns upon us. They have computers now, so trained, that if the Russians were to attack, even after everyone is dead, or most of us are dead in the United States and in the Soviet Union, the machines will continue firing. They're trained. So that you don't need a command. As long as those things, this is what nearly led to tremendous catastrophe a few years ago, and I'm not talking about Cuba, I'm talking about something quite simple and frightening. A flock of geese flew across the Arctic from the direction of Russia, a flock of geese, and the computers were all ready to attack. The computers read the geese as bombers, and they only had to make 1 minute. 1 minute. If they hadn't stopped that error in 1 minute, we would have been all wiped out, because as soon as those computers raced for Russia, the Russian computers would race for us. And they have bombers now. Bombers. I'm not talking about bombers because the bomber is now obsolete. They have intercontinental ballistic missiles that carry 6 megaton bombs in its hold. It can hit 6 cities at the same time. Within a matter of 4 minutes, and it's now being reduced to 2. Within a matter of 4 to 2 minutes, 6 major cities in the United States would turn into gas. They don't smash buildings, they turn them into gas. It reproduces the heat at the heart of the sun, which is 9 million miles away. It reproduces the heat at the heart of the sun for 1 millionth of a second. And those people who see the light, if it hits New York and you saw the light in the sky in New Jersey, you would be instantly blinded. It would scorch the skin of your eyes. Women 100 miles away with babies in their wombs. The baby jumped out, burst out of the flesh, like in the film Alien. And that's the baby bomb they dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's the baby bomb. The bombs they have now are thousands of times more powerful. But let me not brood on that, because I live, as many of you here live, in spite of your grief, and in spite of the centuries of slavery and colonization and oppression, with a certain hope. Because we must preserve. That is why we come here to celebrate what has happened. Because we believe not only in the past, but in the future. I'm going to return to some of these things, but I must go now to my machine. And before I do, I want to mention something that is very important. Before I forget, and that is they have found now not just one African aeroplane. Those of you who have listened to me before have heard me speak of the 2,000-year-old model glider which was found in Egypt, in Cairo, and which has now been established to be the model of a glider, a model of an African glider preceding the Wright brothers by many centuries. We do not know that it had a power source, and if it did, we have not yet found it. But they have now found 14 models in all in Egypt. And they have found that the principles involved in aircraft design are such that it took a century of experimental work from the Wright brothers to discover and perfect that in England and Europe. Well, it's not a century since the Wright brothers, but since work started on aircraft design, it has taken a century to reach to that point. They have found that the shape of the fuselage and the wing reveal design compensations for camber. Camber is the angle of the wing sweep, and that the wing itself of the African airplane was found to be of a design which provided a tremendous lift force, and that it was used for carrying rather than for speed, so that even though it floated slowly through the air, it could carry great weight. And it is similar, in fact, to something that NASA is now working on. NASA, in fact, were the people who informed me about this aeroplane, because they had great doubts about it. And in fact, it was locked up in a glass cage in Cairo since the end of the 19th century, and it was labeled a bird, until Dr. Khalil Messiah, who knows something about airplanes, discovered that birds have legs and this doesn't. That birds do not have reverse dihedral wings, and that birds do not have the kinds of tails that airplanes have. So it was reclassified, and now they're doing work on this, and they're hoping to find one of the actual gliders somewhere under the earth. Nevertheless, I will come back to that. Let us look at the slides so that I can comment on some of these things. This is the conical tower of Zimbabwe. There are various parts of this ruin that survive, extraordinarily thick walls. There are no walls on this earth except the Great Wall of China and the Great Pyramid, which are as thick as these. And they wondered how the Africans could produce this in southern Africa. This was the seat of southern African civilization known as Monomotapa 800 years ago. Right. And they said the Persians built it, and the Chinese built it, and the Portuguese built it, and the Arabs built it, etc. That they had found no prototypes of this architecture anywhere in those places. And recently, the scientists Molete and Kariama scientists, two African Americans, went to Zimbabwe and spent a year and showed that there were 200 prototypes of this building, tiny prototypes, scattered around Mozambique and Zimbabwe, and that this, therefore, is an indigenous nature, and that the extraordinary skill involved, that these things are so massive, and yet there is no proof that they were held together by mortar, something which Africans in Egypt had also achieved. This is very extraordinary, and at one point on the hill where the king could stand and look down 30 miles down the valley and see the slightest movement of a trader or warrior 30 miles away, was so constructed. It had as many people as any city at that time. more than 10,000. This brings us to navigation, where you see the dugout is merely a basic building block for navigational science in Africa, and they build up on this and they have at least 7 types of boats along the line with the longest inland waterway in the world, 2,600 miles long. So that the dugout that Carson has accustomed us to is just a basic building block that does not give us any idea of the complexity of design and the range of boats that were available to Africa. This is a huge dugout showing enormous size of these things. 3 channels are going into this dugout. And you see the enormous size of some of these things on the Nile. This is quite a simple one, but it was presented here the size because they were as wide berth, as sturdy, as wide berth, and as deep as Viking ships. And you see those that are built up. Go ahead. These are other types of boats used for carrying cargo along the Niger in very early times. So this is from East Africa. This is the Mtepe. And here, African maritime peasants, the Swahili, use ships like these to cross the Indian Ocean. And the Chinese before the Africans were shipping elephants to them in the 13th century, 200 years before Columbus, taking elephants to China in their ships. Here you have a ship built by Africans in 1969. Here is called Haidal. Here is Abdullah Jibrin and the Buduma people who built this ship. And this ship crossed successfully from Safi in North Africa to the Caribbean, going as far as Barbados. It crossed more than 2,000 miles before it got into trouble. The reason why it got into trouble is that the rope should have been attached here to the deck as an Egyptian ship, and they cut the rope and it caused it to miss off Barbados, but it already made the journey. What is unusual about this is that it made a drift voyage. In other words, without any pre-knowledge of America, this journey could have been made because the rudder, which was to steer the ship, broke on the first day, so it came to America on the currents. These are the currents that I have spoken about in my work. This is the United States Oceanographic Survey, and it shows you the currents of the Cape Verde Islands just off Africa, moving into the Caribbean, moving all along there, currents off the Senegambia coast that take you to South America. This is where I live, and going right through up into the Caribbean, Gulf Stream, etc., going into the Gulf of Mexico, one of Southern Africa that goes towards South America, into the Caribbean, up into the Gulf of Mexico. Now this is a very important map because it shows you that anything caught 100 miles off Africa where these currents move has to come to America unless the fish get it first. Anything that remains afloat has to come because this has the power almost of a gravitational force. Those of you who know about space machines know that once you come there to another celestial body, unless you have retro rockets, you're coming in, it's pulling you in. You don't have to steer if you come close to any celestial body, whether it be Pluto or Mercury or Venus or Mars or the Moon. Once you reach a certain point, you have to go there, unless you have retro rockets to break out of the gravitational field. This is the power of these currents. Once in this area, near the Essequibo River where I was born and where I grew up, I was sucked into the current that moved into the Atlantic. I fell asleep on my raft, and I was 7 miles offshore when I discovered that I was being sucked into the Atlantic. Fortunately, before the current moved into the Atlantic, it was on the edge of an island about 1 mile away, and I screamed, and 2 speedboats were sent out, engine-driven craft, in order to rescue me. Without engine-driven craft, there was no way to take me out of these currents, which would have pulled me towards Trinidad or on into the Gulf of Mexico, up towards Cuba, one of these places, if I had survived. Hans Lindemann and Alain Bombard have used those currents, and have used those currents and have crossed from Africa to America using primitive dugouts. And the Africans, as I said, had 7 types of craft, but using primitive dugouts, which no African would have used in this ocean unless he was involved in a minor accident. Using those dugouts, Lindemann and Bombard crossed America in less time than even Columbus important to understand that Columbus and Vespucci used not only African intelligence, but they also used certain things developed by Arabs and Africans and other oceans. The sail, which is so critical to navigation, was not developed in Europe. Those sails used by Columbus and Vespucci were Arab-Latin sails used by Africans and Arabs and other oceans. The compass was not developed in Europe. It passed through Arabs, and it was not developed in Europe. And there is a map showing South America, even before South America was discovered, showing the African coastline in relation to South America found in Africa in 1513, indicating the correct latitudinal and longitudinal coordinates between these two continents along these areas where the currents are. And the ships are moving in this very current band. This is found in 1513 at a time when no European could have drawn such a map, because Europe only became aware of latitudinal and longitudinal coordinates, could only plot it with such precision in the 18th century. This is long after the time Columbus came in this direction. This is a sketch, crude as it is, by Dr. Felkin coming out of England, a map showing a cesarean operation among our neurosurgeons. Let me have the next one. This indicates the stitches, and it indicates also the instrument that was used, one of the instruments that was used in this operation. This was in 1879. At this time, which is more than 100 years ago, the cesarean operation was very, very rare in Europe. And invariably in Europe, when this operation was performed, the mother died. In Africa, the mother walked about 8 and 4 days after the operation. Africans were found to be using the cautery iron with great skill, causing minor tissue damage, stitching up the wound. They were found also to be using anesthetics and antiseptics in their operation rooms. Antiseptics were only introduced in the operation rooms of Europe by Lister 2 years early, and it has not yet spread throughout the Europe. Felkin declared that Africans were doing this. They were only witnessed in 1879, but they were doing this many years earlier because they were doing it with routine skill and efficiency. This is the more modern period. This is James West, Bell Laboratories, New Jersey. And there is West before the electron microscope. West is a man who's invented the smallest microphones in the world. Whenever you see, there are certain things that you find in almost all Latin mics and hearing aids, etc. He's the co-inventor of coil electrics, which has had a profound impact on world electronics. Go ahead. Here he is in what is known as the world's quietest room. This is an anechoic chamber. Here he's testing things. He could pick up a sound out in that street with great precision and accuracy. He molds microphones into his ear. He has microphones, he developed a microphone as thin as paper, which can record the pulse of your blood. These are things very difficult to see. They're highly exaggerated here inside. You can see what a finger looks like. You can see this finger is not easy to see. This like here is a little finger.
If you're interested, you must get hold of this book. It is, in all modesty, the first of its kind in the English-speaking world. For a long time, we have been told that blacks invented nothing, explored nothing. Now we have found evidence in every field, whether it be in medicine, or it be in astronomy, or metallurgy, or physics, or mathematics, or agriculture, wherever it is, even in writing systems, etc., we found evidence of Africans working, and later the African American working in these complex fields. What can we do about it? What can we do to remake this world, not only using the skills of the scientists, but using also bringing to science a leavening, bringing to science a peculiar kind of spirit which enables science to remain human, so that it does not become the machine does not become a mockery.
but it has a new eye coded into the machine. The camera has become a mockery because the camera is taken into Africa and they focus on the worst aspects of the African and they say the camera doesn't lie, it is objective, this is the African. But the human behind the machine is subjective, and he invests the machine with those properties so that you get a lie even out of the computer and the machine. How can we stop that machine from becoming an object of death or an object of falsehood? This is where we have come to a critical point in civilization, where it takes more than just scientific genius, but a certain blend, not only the empirical and the intuitive as you find in Dogon science, but a blend also of certain values and qualities which springs out of the African world, which are today dismissed, and which have become, which has turned in upon us. I do remember in the Bible when God said he would save Sodom and Gomorrah if he could find 10 of them worth saving. He could only find one, so he set light to the city. Let us at least provide those 10 men. Let us give a chance for this civilization, not as it is, for this civilization as it is has been built upon the blood and suffering of our people. Let us therefore, in our own way, for no one knows the blueprint, but let us find some way through our new consciousness of what has happened in that past world, of what has happened among our people. Let us find the germ. Let us find the spark. Let us find the old heart to join with the new brain to make this world again. Not a world simply of madmen and oppressors, but a world that will be illuminated by the humanity of our people, which makes sense out of science, which takes technology and doesn't merely make it a sterile thing which will be used for the exploitation of man, but takes science and makes it part of the struggle, part of the effort to remake the world, remake the human, and particularly remake our shattered race. Thank you very much.
Our first venture would be to start with our elders and set up a trust fund that could protect them and enable them to continue their work. So we met with Dr. Ben, we met with Dr. Clarke, and this by no means that we only intend to have this fund provide for those two. They are the elders. We feel they know best. So the fund is put in their names, is here. We are not rich. We saved systematically for a year to get this money. And now we're going to give it to them. And we've devised a way that this can perpetuate itself really forever. It's very simple and it's very mathematical. Here's the form here. We've set it up such that it has the account number in Freedom National Bank in Harlem. It has the account number, and we ask that each person, once a month, at the end of each month, all you have to send is $1. When you multiply that $1, interest compounding daily at money market rates for years and years, multiplied by thousands of people, it will take care of them for the rest of their lives. The money is to be used any way they see fit. They name the next successors. In other words, the next scholars that will get this, they name them. We do not. We divest ourselves of it as a corporation. We acting only as young warrior brothers. And it does not end there. We intend to bring to this black community where we live computers, mathematics, for our children. So with that, I'd like either Dr. Ben and Dr. Clarke to come and receive this money. Just a second.
Thank you very much. Speaking for myself and for Dr. Ben and expressing a sentiment that we've already expressed to each other, we will not use any of this for personal gain at all. We will use it to continue the fight to get information across to people. Dr. Ben must have 7 books all finished, waiting to be published. I have an equal number. Among the things we have talked about is the possibility of a series of small books and converting some of our lectures into pamphlets and developing our work into a language that lay people understand, where our people can get ready and quick information, readable on all kinds of levels. It would permit us to maybe travel a little bit and explain a little more about what's happening in Africa and dig a little deeper so that we might leave for you a record of what you have been and a record of what you are, but a clear indication of what you still have to be.
There's a copy of the letter that explains everything. We're going to send it to Gil Noble, Tony Brown's Journal, community organizations so they can spread the word.
Hey now.
We have the flyer here, the information sheet as to where you can send the money and when you should send it. We're going to put it on the tables in the back. Please pick up one and send your $1.
Yeah.
So this is their official letter, and we're going to give it to them, so you'll probably hear about it, but this is what it's all about. Thank you. And here's the money.
It was asked why I didn't say anything. I have agreed that Dr. Clarke is my senior. But really, he's the elder, and in African tradition, one must trust one's elder. And he will handle the money, and we will discuss it, but he will be in charge of keeping it.
Dr. Ben was not going to miss the opportunity to get in a dig at John. Incidentally, what this demonstrates, brothers and sisters, those of you who have asked,
the information that we receive here, what should I do with it? It should be obvious to you what can be done. Apply yourselves and you'll find answers to what can be done. We're going to have the question for about 20 minutes because we're going to try and get out, and I know the brothers and sisters may want to get a bite to eat, but you can get something to eat at City College right after the forum. We're going to go there, make sure everything is order, and make sure that we have a good time after the forum today. So a few minutes of questions with Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, and we know you want a great deal more time, so if you come to the dance tonight, you'll see Brother Van Sertima, and you may get an opportunity to talk to him. Brother Van Sertima, first question. Your first question, brother.
Before you begin to ask questions, in view of the fact that we only have 20 minutes, could you stick to the subject, please? Blacks in Science, Ancient and Modern. And could you confine yourself to questions and not make statements?
Short, is better to the point. But first of all, I want to congratulate you on your magnificent presentation. My question is, are any of your works being circulated throughout the Caribbean and Africa?
Well, in Africa, my work is being circulated in French, but not in English. Cheikh Anta Diop has written to tell me that it is taking its place among the major underground classics in the French world, but I don't know that it's circulating in English because the English control the book market, and my book is not a book that is favored by the establishment, so it may be some time before it circulates in English-speaking Africa. I can only hope that some of the brothers who are interested in this would help to circulate it in English-speaking Africa. Yes.
Yes, Dr. Sertima, I'd like to go back to the early part of your lecture when you mentioned the sister from Brooklyn, Pat
Collins, yes. Collins, yes.
And the work she's done on the yoga type exercise.
Yes.
The astronaut confined to space capsule.
Yes.
I wondered whether at this point in the technology, that knowledge can be applied to people who are confined to bed or in say a hospitalized situation or a singular situation.
Yes, I'm sure it can. Not being a doctor, I can't comment any further on it, but I do know that you could probably discover that from NASA. You could get hold of their information of Sir Curtis Graves in Washington, and you could probably find out more about precise ways in which this is being done. Some of the things that are being done at NASA are not open to the public. In fact, I was arrested once because I wanted to meet an African-American scientist in the astrophysical laboratory, and some secret military work was going on there. And even though I'd called him, I'd seen him before, in fact, when they weren't watching closely. And I had seen him and talked with him, and he'd shown me his 2 laser machines which were going to be sent up in space. But when I went back to interview him, I found the authorities stopped me in this. They locked me up in a room and started to question me, who the hell are you? You're not an American. You have no right in this building. Who sent you here? And then they asked him if he expected me, and he said no, which he had to because he was afraid for his job. Even though he told me I could come, he said he hadn't invited me. So I said, well, ask NASA, because it was an extension of NASA. But they couldn't find a man at NASA at that time. So they just locked me up there for a while and made inquiries from the British Embassy and so forth to find out who I was, etc. Eventually, after they got someone at NASA, they allowed me to go through, but they would not allow me to see him on his own. I sat at a long table and he had someone sitting beside him, and whenever I asked a question, he looked at the guy and it was bounced off him, and the guy indicated to him what he could answer and what he should not answer. But I think that with respect to medicine, some of the things that are developing in space medicine, some of those things would become public. And all you could do is make an inquiry and see how much of it would be made public. Thank you. Empiricism. You see, the empirical science is like where you're only dealing with facts as you could see them, as you can apprehend them. There is something that involves a leap of the imagination. Einstein was like that. That is why he went so far. There are certain things that you cannot always prove and establish with absolute precision on the basis of all facts known. You have at a certain point to make a leap beyond known into the unknown, and that it's not that the intuition may be pure fantasy. It often is a peculiar leap that uses the factual world as a ground, and it jumps. And very often scientists reach that point. I find it often with doctors. I am absolutely frustrated by doctors. I prefer to diagnose my own illness. I'm often right. I saw my brother nearly died in England because he was suddenly taken ill, and he was practically dying. He had some pain in his brain, and they couldn't tell what it was coming from. And so they put him in a big room, and they said this is probably to some unusual, exotic, tropical disease. So they were treating for a tropical disease, and I went there. He was practically dying. They were giving him all sorts of things. And I looked at him, and I held his nose, and I said, there is an obstruction in his nose. The guy is not breathing properly. That's why he's feeling pain. Nonsense! The next day they called a nose specialist, and there was an obstruction in his nose. He was not breathing properly. And that was it. And they had all these machines. This is where you get empirical data without intuition. The ability to use, even though you're using certain basic empirical data, the ability to make a jump, to use the imagination, another kind of eye, which enables you to enter material in a different way. I think that the Dogon had this in their science. It involved certain, they, for example, were able to intuit the mass of this star, which is impossible even with telescopes. They knew that that was the heaviest type of star in our galaxy. We know it now as a white dwarf where the matter impacts and it becomes so heavy that it could be 4 or 5 times heavier than a star that appears 4 or 5 times larger. That's what I mean by intuition.
So they were unable to see it, but
No, they did see it. I'm saying that beyond seeing it, they were able to intuit its mass. There are certain things that they have revealed, some of which were seen and some of which cannot be seen. It's just like Einstein spoke about certain aspects of relativity, space-time, etc. That has not yet been absolutely established. At least he could not see it very clearly. He was able to work it out to a certain point, and beyond that, there was a leap in the dark. Okay? Yes.
I'm kind of concerned about Prophet Jesus being a brother or who he was, because and his life and death is very important, because one person says that there was a Jacob Ben-Jochannan who lived as a prophet maybe, and he was killed around Passover. And there's another reading that says there was a prophet who was called the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost. And there's another prophet who is called, that's Jesus, and there's another prophet who's called Esau. And they say he says
Esau.
Oh, I see. They say that he taught that God was one, and he depends not loyalty. We all depend on they say Esau says that God is one, on whom we all depend. He beget God, nor is he begotten, and there is none like him. My question is that whoever this person was, he was able to heal the blind, and he was able to make the lame see. And to me, if we're not able to put these scriptures together, we would never be able to retrieve. Our science will never see, the cures and the leprosy and the blind will be able to see, and a lot of the lame walking. So I would really like you to expound maybe a little on which person should I call my brother, the Jesus, the Esau, or the Jacob?
Okay, when I call Jesus a brother, I know he's not European. I can't say with an absolute certainty that he is African. When I call him a brother, I'm speaking of spiritual affinity. I'm speaking of the ground of his philosophy, which is very close to Egyptian Essenism, which he gave an individual flavor and particularity to. In that sense, I speak of him as a brother. And I know also that from all the facts known about him as a historical reality, that he could not be a European. None of these people you mentioned, all of which are candidates, though Joshua Ben Pandira is the best candidate, none of these candidates are European. Okay.
So that's because he's an Egyptian or
he may have been an Egyptian, he may have been a Palestinian. I don't think that he was born in Egypt. He traveled to Egypt. He was smuggled into Egypt. He spent his boyhood in Egypt, in the village of Marathia. And we do not know, as I say, what happened during the 18 years, 12 to 30, where he may have studied Egyptian Essenism. With respect to what you say about blindness and lameness, etc., that is what medicine is involved in. You don't have to perform miracles for that purpose. I mean, you're not going to find a man again, perhaps for a long, long time, who's going to suddenly come along and says, see, okay, hear again, walk. I don't think that we're at that stage in our civilization, shattered as it is. We're going to find men walking in the earth doing things like that easily. It may happen occasionally, but we have to become involved in sciences which do these things, which we are involved in. Because when you look at African science, I only mentioned the cesarean operation, but you have eye cataract surgery in Mali in the 13th century. You have tetracycline. The first use of that antibiotic, tetracycline, was found among Africans 14 centuries ago. They found a measured dosage in their bones. They found a yellow-green flash of tetracycline in their bones. And they found, even though it may initially have been an accident, it's in their grain bins, that they must have used it consciously in measured doses, because where they found it was the lowest incidence of infectious disease in an ancient population. They found the Africans had aspirin before us. The Africans had vaccines before us. Centuries before Jenner, they had vaccines. They invented the smallpox vaccine. They found the Africans, the Zulu alone had 700 medicinal plants, the knowledge of 700 medicinal plants. I've been searching for the past 2 years to find someone in the United States or in Africa who would write a chapter for this book on herbal medicine. I have not yet found any of them, but I'm hoping that someone will come forward. I also need a chapter on drum scripts, which is really quite extraordinary. But I don't want to digress. I'm responding to your question about medicine. Miracles are not only instant. Medical miracles also occur through a slow process of experimentation.
So these mythologies like Isaiah being able to
My sister, I'm sorry to interrupt you. The next question, please.
Yes, my name is Henrik. My concern is about those hungry brothers and sisters in Africa. What are the Africans doing about it? We know it's a conspiracy against us for centuries. But right now, it's becoming evident. It came to my mind that I see a lot of our young brothers who flip out with drugs. Now that they're doing it in one way, they're doing it in another way. Also, I see them really saying out the street, what can we do as Americans to combat this?
All right. Go ahead. Excuse me, my brother. The subject matter was pointed out, and that's what we would like to stick with at this point. And that's not within the purview of what we're discussing today. We thank you very much, though.
Let me just say one word, though, before I go to the next question. The question of hungry bellies is with us. We cannot ignore that. But why are you going to ask me? I'm not in charge of this country. Why don't you ask yourself? You know, because we are all part of that terrible scene of hunger and suffering in this country. We have to do things about that. The important thing here which we are involved in is creating a consciousness in which we start to do such things. Those gentlemen who did that thing just now are very unusual gentlemen. You do not know what a departure that is from the scientists trained in this country. This is how one begins to deal with hungry bellies. There are no instant miracles. People are searching for instant miracles. here is someone who's going to come and tell them how I'm going to feed all the hungry bellies in the world. Christ couldn't do that. Even God can't do it. If he wanted to do it, he certainly hasn't done it. You feed hungry bellies by a process. You have certain kinds of societies, you do certain kinds of things. That is not something that somebody can say, oh, I have a solution here in my pocket. This is how you feed hungry bellies. These are the terrors of the world. This is the terror of the human condition, living in an age when we have capacities, technological capacities to feed the world, and yet our people are living like dogs in the street. That is what you have to address yourself to. And that has to do with a certain state of mind, a state of mind which afflicts us, a state of mind that reduces to slavery, not just the hungry bellies. Our ancestors for centuries have had hungry bellies. I am speaking today with power because I speak from a hungry belly. I lived in the heart of this civilization that made me hungry for many things, not just for food, because as the Bible says, man shall not live by bread alone, but hungry in my heart, in my soul, for a great deal. One does not speak with that intensity suddenly. One speaks with it because all through our lives, the lives of our ancestors, the lives of our people, we have lived with a great hunger, and that is what we are addressing ourselves to.
Brothers and sisters, we're very fortunate that we have had a good beginning because the day is well begun. We have the dance to go to now. We will see Brother Van Sertima there. Before you leave, though, there are no more journals available for sale today. That means you will return next week to purchase a copy. If you need any tapes, please stop in the back. And we'll see you at City.